And so that's why, my friends, you cannot call a retarded person retarded anymore. Good afternoon, friends. In this video, I'm going to tell you why you can't use the words retarded or midget anymore, even if you mean well by it. But before I do, please subscribe to the channel if you're not already, like the video, and comment on the video for the sake of the algorithm. Now let's get started. First of all, we have to define some words. In particular, we really need to know what the word euphemism is. A euphemism is a mild or indirect way to express something that's considered undesirable. The etymology, which means word origin, of the word euphemism comes from Greek. Eu means something like good, and femism is speaking or speech, so it's sort of good speech. In fact, the ancient Greeks had a word called eupheme, which referred to a female spirit that was thought to be a spirit of good words or praise. The opposite of the word euphemism is a dysphemism. A dysphemism is something that exaggerates the undesirable traits of something. So for example, a dysphemism for a mental hospital is a loony bin. And before we move on, let's comment on the etymology of the word loony. Loony, lunatic, they all originate from the same origin as lunar, related to the moon. And this is because humans historically thought that insanity somehow related to the visible appearance of the moon. Anyway, a dysphemism is something that's inordinately negative, referring to something already undesirable. So there's a dysphemism, a euphemism, and an orthophemism is supposed to be a direct way of speech that's indicating exactly what people are saying. And by the way, what are we really talking about here? We're talking about the fact that words have their own definitions and connotations. The definitions may be formally derived, but we may have connotations to certain words that are not formally derived and that may develop over time. And what's really fascinating here is we're going to talk about something called the euphemism treadmill, first introduced by Steven Pinker in 2003 in the book The Blank Slate. What the euphemism treadmill refers to is the observed phenomenon of euphemisms turning into dysphemisms over time. People creating euphemisms to protect others from the actual meaning of words, and then those actual euphemisms become negatively connotated over time and become undesirable speech. And this goes round and round. Every time a euphemism is created, it eventually actually gets the connotation of the word being described and therefore gets disregarded. By the way, a side note, Steven Pinker is a great writer. If you haven't read his books, please do. I've read all of them. Steven Pinker is actually a cognitive scientist who focuses on linguistics. He was a former professor at MIT and Harvard, and one interesting fact about him is he, like me, tends to wear cowboy boots and even wears them with suits, which I've honestly never been brave enough to do myself. Now, most euphemisms arise naturally. What happens is that the former euphemism turns into a dysphemism, it's disliked by people, and someone creates a new euphemism. But they're sometimes designed formally. For example, affirmative action. Most Americans have heard that term. What does it really mean? It means reverse racial discrimination. And even if you're not American, you've probably heard the American euphemism for torture, which is enhanced interrogation. These are formally defined words that were created by governments in order essentially to deceive people. But does this actually work? Do people actually get deceived by euphemisms? And can governments actually trick us by using them? It does. A 2021 paper found that when describing something like torture with the words enhanced interrogation, people viewed the actual item itself as being more favorable, even though they knew what was happening exactly. Whereas if a dysphemism or an orthophemism was used, they viewed the action less favorably. Moreover, when euphemisms were used in deceitful speech, the participants did not view the euphemism users as less trustworthy. So the authors concluded that strategic speech could favorably influence the opinion of others. Essentially, that deceitful speakers could get away with it. We wouldn't know they were being deceitful, and we would think of them and their actions more favorably. I want to give you two more examples of the euphemism treadmill so it can really hit home. First, let's think about the subject of being physically handicapped. Historically, this was called being crippled. A cripple was somebody, not an offensive term, somebody that did not have full use of their body. This turned into handicapped or disabled, and then turned into special needs or differently abled. And this is such a distortion of the original meaning that really, if you think about someone from the 19th century hearing differently abled, they may think that this person has a superpower. And let's take a final example from the R word, retarded, which you cannot use anymore and you may get shamed or cancelled for using. The R word, retarded, retarded was historically actually itself a euphemism. Because originally, medical doctors categorized people according to their level of what we now call intellectual disability. Originally, a person that had an IQ of less than 20 was called an idiot, and a person that had an IQ of between 20 and 49 on the edge of 50, 20 to 50 was called an imbecile, and a person that had an IQ between 50 and 70 was called a moron. This may shock you because the word moron sounds like a dysphemism now, but in reality it was originally an orthophemism. It was just describing what the medical doctors saw. And we can make another note here, interestingly. As a word goes from being an orthophemism to being unacceptable, it becomes an acceptable dysphemism, such that you could now call one of your friends who's not actually mentally challenged a moron without sounding too offensive. But you still can't call him a retard completely yet. But eventually you'll be able to call him retarded, but you won't be able to call somebody who's actually retarded. But then the euphemism gains the connotation of what we're really describing, although I have another theory, which is that the euphemism becomes used as a dysphemism, and that may cause people to not like it as a euphemism. Although that's just my theory. What the euphoric treadmill says is that the euphemism gains the connotation of the actual meaning we're describing, and therefore no longer becomes a euphemism, so it gets turned into something unacceptable, and another euphemism gets adopted. In this case, the euphemism that was adopted was intellectually disabled or intellectually challenged or mentally challenged. And so that's why, my friends, you cannot call a retarded person retarded anymore. Although soon you may be able to call a non-retarded person retarded, the way you can now call someone else an idiot, a moron, or an imbecile. Anyway, friends, I hope you found this interesting. Please comment below and let me know what you think of the euphemism treadmill. Does it annoy you? Do you think people are being deceitful or we're deceiving each other and getting away with it? Are we by nature running away from the truth? Should we be more direct to each other, or should we always be bending over backwards to not offend people about what we're actually describing? Anyway, friends, thank you so much for bearing with me. I'll see you again tomorrow morning.